Welcome to this week's episode of the Liberty Unveiled podcast, formerly the Teshuah Unveiled podcast. I am your host, Brad Hopp, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Pastor Sam Jones. Together, we are unveiling liberty one episode at a time. We'll be discussing the latest in trafficking news, insider stories from those being delivered, and studying the Founders Bible to learn how to return America to sanity and true freedom. Our sponsor for today's show is Teshuah Tea Company. Visit TeshuahTea.com or DeliveranceTea.com. Hi, and welcome to the Liberty Unveiled podcast. I'm your host, Brad Hopp, and as you can tell, my friend Pastor Sam Jones was able to be here again this week. So
you can call me by what I really am, the bad influence that takes us, onto rabbit trails and never gets us back on.
No, we had a lot of fun with it. So, so last week, or in the earlier episode that we were recording this morning, we talked about preparing your children for marriage and kind of returning to a patriarchal mindset in the homes and stuff a little bit. And I know there's so much talk about toxic masculinity, and as Pastor Chase and Pastor Kerry have said, and I firmly agree with them, it's not that we have toxic masculinity, it's that we don't have masculinity in America.
Right.
We're really lacking on it. True godly masculinity that empowers women to be feminine and be who they were created to be, and yet allows men to be who they were created to be, with the protectors and the defenders. And
well, I mean, you think about it. God designed masculinity, and it says that He said that was good. Mm-hmm. He also created femininity,
right,
and called it good too.
Right.
Now it's men need to be men, women need to be women. Mm-hmm. He made a distinction there. But because of those things, they honestly can't be toxic.
Right.
As long as they're applied correctly.
Right.
And so as soon as it becomes toxic, it's no longer masculinity. In fact, I would say that the issue is that we have a bunch of people who are males who aren't men, boys that can shave, but they're not doing what's right.
Right. They're 2-year-olds that never grew up. And if you think about it, really a lot of people in America today act like 2-year-olds, especially if you watch these protesters and stuff. It's really that they are acting like 2-year-olds because they don't get what they want, and so they start throwing a fit. What does a 2-year-old do? They throw a fit when they don't get what they want, and so
Sorry, that just hits really, really at home right now. We've got a 20-month-old. I mean,
it's just starting, my friend.
well, the other day, I'm sitting there watching him, and he starts throwing a fit and pointing. But he's pointing at nothing. And I'm going, what? Huh? What? So finally I pick him up and I travel to where he is pointing. We get there, and then he points, we get to a hallway, he points to the next room, walk there, points for me to turn, do that, points me into the kitchen. We go there, points at the vanilla wafers, smiles and says, please, please, please. And I'm going, are you kidding me? From the living, you wanted vanilla wafers. and I mean, he was sitting there, we're in the living room, and he's playing with his toys, and all of a sudden, point. I'm like, are you kidding me, kid? Oh. So I gave him vanilla wafers, and hopefully didn't enable him to become a peaceful protester later on, or a quote-unquote peaceful protester. No. But I was just kind of laughing because I was like going, well, you knew what you want.
Yeah, well, and they have such funny ways of communicating sometimes when they're little, and you feel bad for them a little bit because they can't communicate. They don't know how to get their point across, and even as adults, sometimes they don't know how to get their point across without throwing a temper tantrum, and it's just like...
As long as they're throwing a temper tantrum and not a brick, that's okay. No.
It's not much better. But, and really that goes back to fathers not doing their job and really not teaching and training their children as they should. And so, a lot of times, a lot of the kids that you're seeing out there protesting really are kids who grew up in a mom-dominated, woman-centered house, and they never really learned how to be men and how to I mean, you look at the Israelites, and they have the bar mitzvahs and the bat mitzvahs, and by the time you're 12 and 13 years old, you're expected to know, you know, the foundational things that you should know. And if you look at, as we've read through, and you look at the teaching and the training, when a father was actively involved in the foundation of our nation, when the fathers were there teaching and training their children, you look at the foundational, like you said, John Adams was an ambassador to a foreign country by the time he was like,
I think it was 13 or 14. Yeah.
I mean, that's just amazing to me. And so,
I mean, I was picking my nose and eating my boogers by the time I was 13 or 14, but that's about it. You know?
Yeah, you know, and so it really kind of
the milkman was calling
it. It is the milkman, literally. That's literally who it is. It's a friend of mine who's he drives for Anderson Eric's or Highland Dairy. So anyway, but you know, we have such a nation of fatherlessness that's the reason you're seeing a lot of the problems that we're having today, because we have so many fathers that are absent, and that's one of the things, going back to with Teshuah Tea Company, with the girls that we rescue, you know, either they were abused by dad, or they were sold by, you know, parents, or they were kidnapped by uncles or whatever. And so you have to have that rebuilding, but the only way that rebuilding happens is through their salvation and getting to know the true Father, Father God. And that fatherhood of Father God is what really spawned America. And because our founding fathers knew Father God and they understood him as Father, and they understood him as just and justice and mercy and fair and equitable, and they knew how to apply the law in a godly way.
Well, when it comes to this toxic masculinity, which, just going to put it out here, this was not at all what we would plan direction-wise to go, and I feel like that's every episode, but I think it's where God's leading, so I think it's a good place to go. We believe in equality of value, but not equality of function. But when you believe in equality of function, and a society accepts that as a whole, which our society in America, generally speaking, has systemically accepted it as a whole, that we believe in equality of function. Anything you can do, I can do better, and you got the guy and the girl sitting there singing back and forth. No, you can't. Yes, I can. No, I can't. Yes, I can. Well, you know, the problem is that when you have a perpetuated lie that we are equal functionally, people believe that lie, and then they put that lie to the test, and they act as though that this is true. You know, I'm going to be crude for just a moment. You don't hear about too many forcible rapes from women on men. Right. Why don't you hear that? Because they can't do it, generally speaking. No.
Well, and most times guys are probably, I hate to say it, more than willing.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's true too. You know, more than willing. But why is it if both people have been drinking, why is it only the man who's the one who's doing the rape when it's that? You know, it could have been the other way, and we never talked about it that way. Well, it's because men are physically stronger. Now, when you're taught that they're equally functional, equal in functionality, and men go and they force themselves upon women, and they're going, well, you told me you're equally functional, why couldn't you fight back? Right. Now that's not an excuse for the man by any sense. Right. Because real masculinity teaches that man to use that strength for protection and provision. Right. And not for force. And I'm not just talking about sexually, but in all kinds of other things too. I mean, my goodness, we've got men who sit out there and say, I'm a woman, and then they go and put a women's swimming suit on. Yeah, I'm making fun of you wrestlers now. Put on a singlet, and they go out there and they wrestle women. And I mean, that's disgusting. I mean, I've seen, you know, the MMA where men go and they fight in women's division and they crush the skulls of women. It's disgusting. Right. They're not, but it's not just in those kind of things. It's in all kinds of different things. men ought to use their strength for protection and provision. And by the way, that's not to devalue the woman, because my goodness, there are things that I absolutely cannot do that my wife does. I mean, just the other day I was talking to my wife. I said, look, I'm getting really busy and all this kind of stuff. And I said, I'm having a really tough time keeping my calendar. And I said, would you be able to help me out with that? And she goes, oh, I love keeping calendars. I mean, she's all excited to do it. And for me, I'm like, I hate this.
Yeah.
And I'm not good at it.
Yeah.
And I mean, she is an absolute excellent organizer. Me?
Kind of like me.
Nobody's ever called me an excellent organizer. I can tell you that.
Actually, you know what? I am an organizer when it comes to packing stuff. When I was in college, I don't know what it is about spatial usage and stuff. I could get my entire dorm room, and I had a lot of crap. I could get my entire dorm room into the back seat and the trunk and the front passenger seat of my little Escort, and man, I could, but yeah, I'm not as. My wife is much better at calendar organizing. I'm like, she's like, well, didn't you look at the calendar? Oh yeah, we have a calendar on the fridge, don't we? Oh yeah.
See, I'm the kind of guy that, you know, have you looked at the calendar? I was the kind of person that when I kept a planner by myself, normally it was at the end of the month I filled in what I did. And I realized that's not really what that's for.
Oh yeah. But you know, going back to what we were talking about, you know, as far as masculinity and stuff, and I saw this meme the other day, and it was talking about when guys say they,
or as the boomers call it, the mimes.
Yeah, when they like.
Sorry. that was a bad joke.
Yeah,
right
it was. Okay, it took me a second. I'm like, what? Oh yeah. When they talk about liking strong women, they don't want overbearing, dominant, pushy, arrogant, rude. That's not what is really portrayed as. That's just being a jerk. That's not being a strong woman. A strong woman is one that is able to.
Unfortunately, in our society, I think it's confusion. Because that's like I'm going. Whenever I see a quote unquote, like you said, a world's view of a strong woman, I'm going. Most of the time, I'm going. If only you knew.
Right, and the Bible talks about that, because really they're called contentious women, and the Bible says it would be better to dwell on a housetop, on the corner of the housetop. Don't even live inside the house. It would be better to dwell on the corner of the housetop, out in the elements, than it would be to dwell inside of the house with a contentious woman. And we have so many women that, because of the women's lib and the suffrage that happened in the, you know, the women's right to vote and all this stuff that happened in the early 1900s, that got this mindset that you have to be brash and domineering and you know, just a bully to get your way. Well, they really destroyed the idea of femininity, and yet at the same time, you can be very feminine and a strong woman at the same time, and be.
I think it was Pastor Tweed who pointed this out in the Household of Faith conference. You know, when he's confronted with the idea that a homemaker woman is not a strong woman, he says, well, I look back in the book of Genesis, and I find that the homemaker woman named Eve had so much power that when there was only 3 people and one of them had to make a decision, he listened to her above God. And that's not in a sense of you know, endorsing her decision, but it is speaking to her strength as a homemaker and not being a domineering, brash personality like you were talking about.
Right.
And think about that strength. A woman can sway a man to listen to her above God when she's not being brash.
Right. And you know, there is something very beautiful in a feminine woman that is strong. I mean, my wife is a very strong lady. You know, she's I mean, you've met my wife. She's only 5'4", and she's not physically strong. She is. She can go out in the garden and work and pull weeds and all that stuff, but she's not near as strong as I am.
I was going to say, I'd put my money on you in an arm wrestling match.
Yeah. But at the same time, she has had the strength and the fortitude to go through being married to a visionary. To kind of fill our listeners in, my wife likes to read there's another ministry called it's the Pearls, Michael and Debbie Pearl, and they run a ministry, or they have a newsletter that they put out called To Train Up a Child. And with part of their ministry, they also do a book, or have done a book called Preparing to Be His Helpmeet, Created to Be a Helpmeet, and it really kind of helps women understand the role of being a godly wife and godly mother, and what is my place as and speaking as a woman, what is my place as a woman? How does that fit into the marriage, and how does that fit into the union here, and what is, because we've lost so much of that. They kind of help women rediscover that their role and their place and their positioning and stuff. And
well, what this is kind of reminding me of was this really brash, cavalier pastor from Sioux City, Iowa, put out a Facebook post. Pastor Kerry, I absolutely love Pastor Kerry, but he put out this Facebook post about how we could destroy Marxism in our nation if we went back to voting, the voting principles before women's suffrage, and that drew him a lot of heat. Now, for those who are historically illiterate, which is 98% of you out there, let me just fill you in here. The reason what he's talking about is Marxism doesn't believe in private property. Before women's suffrage, he wasn't actually bashing on women, as a lot of people took it. He was bashing on the fact that before women's suffrage, only those who owned private property could vote. Right. And so if you go back to those who only own private property, inherently they will protect their private property and that right, and it will destroy Marxism. I mean, it has no footing. But one of the things on there of just people just lighting him up were these people who came out here and said, "Oh, you're this sexist, da 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 da," and all this kind of stuff. There's probably not a stronger woman that I can think of off the top of my head. Oh, I didn't say I had tea here. Squirrel. But than Molly, than his wife Molly.
Than Pastor Eileen.
Yeah, I don't know her real well, but I know Molly pretty well.
I have. Pastor Eileen is the epitome of a Southern belle. Pastor Eileen, and going back to her foundational roots, Pastor Eileen is well. First off, you wouldn't want to mess with her because Pastor Larry would probably take care of you, and then if he didn't, Pastor Kerry and Pastor Chase would probably both take care of you. But Pastor Eileen is actually Hatfield McCoy. She is actually on both sides of her family. She's Hatfield McCoy, so she's not probably one to be trifled with, but she's just as sweet as a peach. Yep. She is as sweet as a peach, and but she is, the epitome of a Southern belle, and going back to what I was talking about with the Pearls, they had this book called Created to Be His Helpmeet, and it talks about the three types of men. There's the steadies that are just happy to go to work, 9 to 5, come home, just live their life, church, work, sleep, eat, Then there's command men they're the leaders. They're the guys that are usually corporate CEOs. They're the command men, or they're the get it done type guys. If they're not saved, they can also be the guys that people think of as being just complete jerks that nobody wants to have anything to do with. But then there's the visionaries, and the visionaries are the guys that wake up every morning and have a new idea about how something can be done. Not that I would ever be that, but my wife usually, my family just goes, oh no. My dad's like, they usually try to let me sleep as much as I can.
That's why they kept putting that stuff in. Oh.
But no, they, so there's the visionaries, and so you have these different types of men, but being the wife of a visionary is not necessarily easy. It takes a strong woman to be able to put up with all the new ideas and
So what were those types again here?
Steady, command man, and visionary. And we're all going to have a mixture. I mean, but we're going to have a dominant in certain areas. And
yeah, I think I'm a visionary. I spend a lot of time sitting there talking to my wife going, what do you think about this new idea? And she sits there and goes, wow, that's dumb. No, she doesn't really. Not really.
No, but that's why we get along so well, because we speak the same language, and we are always like, hey, we can do this, and we can do that, and we can, But the visionaries are the ones that come up with the ideas.
Spread themselves way too thin sometimes.
They do. They have that tendency, but they're the ones that come up with the ideas. Thomas Edison. They're the ones that come up with the light bulb ideas. They're the ones that come up with the new inventions. And so you need those type of people, but you really have to have. They have to be partnered with somebody that's going to be a complement to them.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you begin to understand that it takes a strong woman to be married to a commandment. It takes a strong woman to be married to a visionary, and this really not it's not the idea that we have of this dominatrix or this dominant, just brutish, bullish woman, and that's not
right.
That's not what it's about. And there was something you were talking about that I wanted to go back to. In regards to the strong woman.
Didn't have to do with push-ups, did it?
No.
Okay. No.
Libby Bruins challenged me to that 21 or 22 push-ups.
Yeah, I haven't seen any videos.
You're not going to either. Like, I don't have time for that.
Well, first of all, I mean, it took you at least 3 days to figure out should I do them one-handed or two-handed.
Yeah.
But
and actually, it wouldn't be that difficult. I could easily do it, but I'm not gonna do it. My sons are kind of the same way. They're like, I'm not doing that. Although Julius did do the ice bucket challenge, but I don't think we added any ice to it. But we took the loader out and filled the loader with water and then dumped it over. So that was just more for because it was hot and we were bored. I think that day.
I generally don't do the challenges on social media either.
But anyway, let's pick up where we were talking about last time. So we were talking about the Puritans and where they, kind of how they.
All right, well, it starts off talking about Germany, kind of in the persecution there, and then it kind of moves into England and talks about really the Reformation or the revival that starts to happen in England because the Geneva Bible comes out.
Mm-hmm.
And this is kind of where we're going to pick up here, and they're about to have some persecution too, but this persecution is what drove people to America. Now, I know we're both on the same page on this one here because this is a teaching that Pastor Kerry gives.
Mm-hmm.
We're not those who believe that persecution is the best option for Christianity. There are some people who believe, well, if you want revival, and I spent a lot of time in my life, I'm not too old, but a few years of my life anyway, believing this fallacy of the only way you can get revival is through persecution. Now, when persecution comes, it does separate the wheat from the chaff, no doubt. But the way that, to steal a word from the left, the way that Christianity flourishes is actually when it obeys God's principles. And that's duh when somebody points it out, but our Christianity doesn't quite grasp that many times. We believe in this because we've seen great things happen out of persecution. We think that you must have persecution, but really, the greatest that we see is when when people are obedient. We'd rather have an obedient child than a prodigal one.
Right.
But nonetheless, persecution is about to come, but we're about to read it, and God works through it. And so I'll pick up here the last paragraph on page 96. There it says, many of these new believers came to be called Puritans. They were passionate in their religious convictions and committed to the reformation of the Church of England, wanting to purify it from what they felt were empty and dead rituals. Others convinced the Church of England was simply too corrupt to be reformed and believed that the only real choice was to separate from it altogether. Splintering away from the Puritan movement, they became derogatorily known as separatists or dissenters. At this time, the Church of England was a creation of the state. Being a state-established church, headed by the king or queen, controlled in its cooperation by state mandates. The church existed by permission of the civil government. Which I never thought about it in these terms here. All kinds of thoughts are coming to my mind, but that is the wrong start for a church. It shouldn't be established by the state, and it doesn't need the permission by the state to exist. But we probably don't need to get into that too much.
Right. Well, I actually talked about it on the last episode that I recorded by myself. I talked about how Thomas Jefferson, everybody wants to throw the separation of church and state thing out there, and that really it's not anywhere in the Constitution. It's not anywhere in the Declaration of Independence. It's not anywhere in the Bill of Rights. It's not anywhere in any of our founding documents. It actually comes from a letter
to the Danbury Baptists.
Yeah, you said Danbury Baptist. Yeah, and it was him reassuring them that there was a wall between the government interfering into the church. It was a semi-permeable wall, though, because it was not saying that the church could not have any influence. In fact, as I said in the last episode that I recorded, that the founding fathers believed that pastors and
well, John Witherspoon was a pastor and a signer of the Declaration of Independence.
They believed that the lay people and pastors had every duty and every obligation to be a part of the government and to have a say there.
Yeah, in fact, they believed that our government wouldn't stand without these principles. In Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptist, it's amazing what happens when you read things in context. It's the same thing with what everybody cites for judicial review, Marbury versus Madison. If you go back to Marbury versus Madison, that court case, basically, probably not to quite give it complete justice in understanding the whole thing, John Adams, one of my favorite founding fathers, but he did something he shouldn't have done here. As he was leaving office because he lost the election to Thomas Jefferson, of course, we know that there was a great rivalry between Adams and Jefferson, and then they become great friends after that. But he didn't like Adams, so he was a Federalist, Adams didn't like Jefferson. Well, same, they didn't like each other. But Adams was a Federalist, Jefferson was a anti-Federalist, and so Adams goes and he appoints, like just before he leaves, all these people to get in these positions who are Federalists. And the Secretary of State at the time, who was appointed to become on the Supreme Court, didn't have a chance to carry out all of these appointments. And Jefferson becomes president, and the new Secretary of State, James Madison, he goes and he decides he's not going to go and carry out these appointments. Well, they have this court case. One of the guys, by the last name of Marbury, he goes and gets all upset because he's supposed to become a judge on in some court, and he's like, "Yo, I'm supposed to be a judge. I don't care if the appointment didn't get to me before you became president. You have to go and appoint me." And the court goes and says, "Well, according to I don't remember the name of this thing that had been adopted. They said, yeah, you have to do this, or you're supposed to do this." Well, Jefferson and Madison scoffed at this so much, neither one of them even show up for the gavel, the ruling, so to say, not ruling, opinion of the court. They don't do it. They don't appoint this guy. And everybody goes and says, well, this is judicial review. Well, actually, if you go and you read it, they say, yeah, we think that you should do this, but we don't have any authority to make you do this. And they're like, yeah, you're right. You don't have any authority to do it, and we're not doing it. And that's what everybody cites for judicial review or judicial rulings. That's ridiculous. But the same thing is true with this letter to the Danbury Baptist, talking about separation of church and state, where Jefferson uses the phrase, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Is what, in the context that he's talking about. The Danbury Baptists, they come up and they say, and I preach on this every year, being a Baptist, I think this is something that's important. They said that they were worried. They said, hey, we're seeing this thing come into power. We're worried that there's going to become a state-ordained church, a state-mandated church, and it wasn't going to be, their church. And Jefferson comes up and he says, no. That is not going to happen. There is a separation between church and state, not keeping church out of the state, but keeping the state out of the church. The state has no jurisdiction into ecclesiastical law, is essentially what he's saying. And everybody cites this, and they're like, look, so you keep your politics out of the pulpit. So I'm getting on my bandwagon here because this is something I hear all the time, and I'm going...
You don't even understand the source document that you're talking about.
Right. And there are many people, well, the Constitution says... The Constitution doesn't say anything. In fact, the Constitution says the opposite.
Yep.
Oh man, you're getting me going here.
Well, but there's actually...
I got 4 sermons on this right now.
But there's actually a section in here, and I wish I could find it right now, but I'm not going to, where they actually talk about how far we've actually left the judicial process, and how adulterated it has become, because we don't understand what the power of the judges, and more importantly, what the power of the juries were.
Right, the judges had way more power than the judges. The juries did.
They had a huge amount more power, and now the juries have been just really castrated and made impotent.
Well, if you read the Declaration of Independence, one of the grievances is that they didn't have a hearing by jury.
Right.
And one thing you need to understand about the Founding Fathers, in their political philosophy, there was this overwhelming agreement of kind of 2 things. One, they did not want non-represented power. So whether that was oligarchy, whether that was tyranny, whether that was aristocracy, whether that was whatever it might be.
Right.
They didn't want that. The other thing is, because then most people automatically think democracy. They also said, we hate mob rule.
Right.
And so therefore, they were for representation. And I mean, so much so that actually when our country was founded, the people didn't directly vote upon senators. It was the House of Representatives that elected the senators. The people directly voted on the representation, the representatives, the House of Representatives. They obviously directly voted upon also president, but it was then the Electoral College, so it wasn't even just mob rule there.
Right.
And we don't vote on the judges, and so they wanted to have the least amount of power in the judges, the second least amount of power actually in the executive branch, and the most power in the legislative branch, but they're all checks and balances between those, but it wasn't equal power.
Right.
I mean, at all. It wasn't even kind of equal. The judges had by far the least amount of power, and we see, I would say the opposite of that today, although right now we're in the midst of a huge executive overreach. But
Right. I'm going to see if I can find that. But going back to what you're talking about here, this kind of ties back to...
I don't even remember how this ties into what we just read, but it's a great rabbit trail for us to go down. Okay, so the 3 branches of government. You've got the executive branch, which executes power. You've got the judicial branch, which says guilty, not guilty. And then you have the legislative branch that actually makes the rules. And ultimately, the judicial branch is dependent upon the actual rules or laws that are made. And this is actually a picture of God. God is an executive, an executioner, so to say. He's the one who has the enforcing power. He is also a judge, guilty, not guilty. And he is the one who is the law giver and lawmaker. But his guilty, not guilty pronunciation is based upon what?
It's based upon his word.
Yeah, those laws that were given. He doesn't just come out and say, you know what? You're a redhead. I don't like you because you're a redhead. Guilty. He doesn't do that. It's perfectly just based upon his laws. And this is what our founding fathers saw. They saw God as these three things. No man, is what they said, can rightly fulfill these three things, so they separated these branches of government.
Right.
And it's just a beautiful thing and a beautiful picture of God, and this is what they're tying it all back to. Did you have a chance to find the...
No, but...
I was trying to babble. So.
Yeah, but what they're talking about is, they're talking about the...
Well, and I've seen this in the Founders Bible too, and I'm just desperately trying to think, where is that?
329, I think.
By the way, it'd be good to just talk about for a little bit, I guess. What we've been going through is the Founders Bible. Well, what we've been attempting to go through is the Founders Bible. We get distracted.
Right.
My fault. And this is put out by David Barton and Wall Builders. That's right. I was going to say the American Heritage Series, but that's also put out by Wall Builders. Excellent resource. Every home should have a Founder's Bible. I mean, just absolutely excellent. There's other good ones too out there, but man, you know, every American household should have one of these.
From the beginning, America's juries had a twofold responsibility: examine the facts in a particular case and judge the law at the center of the controversy. They understood that if a law was tyrannical, enforcing it would prevent justice rather than secure it. So let me back up here a little bit, because I think this one is extremely, extremely important. The Bible established specific procedure to be used in courtroom proceedings, and the objective of each was to secure justice. For example, Deuteronomy, this is on page 329.
229? Okay.
Yeah. For example, Deuteronomy 19:15 through 18 stipulates, "A single witness shall not rise up against a man on account of any iniquity or any sin which he has committed. On the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter shall be confirmed. If a malicious witness rises up against a man to accuse him of wrongdoing, then both the men who have the dispute shall stand before the Lord, before the priests and the judges who will be in office in those days. The judges shall investigate thoroughly." Many other scriptures address courts, judges, legal proceedings, and all pointed to the same purpose: securing justice. For additional passages on the judiciary, see the commentary accompanying Deuteronomy 17 verse 6. So let me say that again. Deuteronomy chapter 10, Deuteronomy 17 verse 6, Joshua 7, 1 Samuel 7, Proverbs 18:17, Isaiah 1:26, and 2 Corinthians 3. Significantly, the due process clauses of the United States Constitution, the 4th through the 8th Amendments, also contain specific provisions to secure justice in court proceedings, and those provisions are based heavily on Bible teachings. This fact is affirmed even by modern Supreme Court justices who are not at all considered religious, but who nevertheless make this acknowledgement simply because the history is conclusive. To learn more about how the Bible directly shaped the Constitution's due process clause, see the Federal Practices and Procedure, Federal Federal Rules of Evidence, and I think that's a section in here. In the millennium preceding American colonizations, courts had been used as political enforcement machinery. Courts or justice was definitely not their objective, and you're seeing that again.
Mm-hmm.
And especially in a lot of third world countries and even second world countries, and even a lot of first world countries, you're seeing that same thing, where courts are being used as a political machine, and they're not being used for justice.
Well, you're seeing that in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Many of the in the 15th and 16th centuries, many of the dissenters, those who followed Bible teachings and opposed the corruption of state-run churches, had been tried, convicted, and punished by these tyrannical courts. And they began pointing out biblical passages that illustrated the proper use of courts. But after decades of continued judicial persecution and cruelty, and no success in securing judicial reform, large waves of dissenters departed from Europe for America, specifically citing the judicial corruption in America or European courts as a reason for leaving.
Now, hold on. Isn't that just incredible how God just worked that out? Mm-hmm. Who are these dissenters they're talking about?
The Pilgrims.
The separatists that we were just reading about, and with Pilgrims, Puritans.
Mm-hmm.
Because ultimately the Puritans, though they were not wanting to be separatist or dissenters, they were kicked out, so whether they wanted to separate or not. And so it's amazing how we're reading one passage and we're still reading the same thing, just in a different light.
Right, and that's why I think this ties in so well. Upon their arrival, the dissenters took deliberate steps to ensure that the judicial system here excluded the problems and practices that had characterized the English judicial system. And this is why it is so important that when there is a vote for judicial retention, oftentimes I'll just vote no on all of them, because a lot of them need booted.
Generally.
Huh?
It's generally my practice, unless I know somebody's really good. Yeah, I mean, well, and you probably had a pretty first-hand experience in seeing 3 state Supreme Court justices getting booted out. That was the first vote I ever was able to vote in.
Really?
Yeah.
That was we were
first election, I should say, not vote. I voted on different things like primaries and things.
Right.
Like in a primary.
Our church was really one of the spearheads. There was a couple other churches in the state of Iowa that spearheaded it as well, joined forces with us. One actually not too far from you, Pastor Shane Philpott over in Mason City. Yeah, he's over in Mason City. He was another pastor that was really instrumental in the Iowa Supreme Court decided to go through judicial activism and voted to allow homosexual marriage. They magically found something that's not even talked about in the Iowa Constitution, and they magically found it there. The funny part on that case is that the 2 ladies that were the ones that brought that to the Iowa Supreme Court are both born again and now go to our church. They both got born again through our church, and they both now go to church. And they actually had their
I'm assuming repented of their homosexuality.
They repented of their sin, and they actually went through a divorce. And the judge wasn't going to grant them the divorce. He was fighting them on it
because it would look so bad for
because it looked so bad for him. But they actually are.
And by the way, it's not a real divorce because it was never a real marriage.
Yeah, it was never a real marriage, But anyway, so it's interesting how God worked that all out, and now they actually attend pretty faithfully. So let me continue on here. So they believed that one of the most effective means for securing justice was by the use of juries, a practice largely excluded in Europe. Original jurors in America exercised powers far beyond those of modern jurors, who today often serve as not much more than spectators in a court, watching so-called legal experts perform in front of a robed referee. Originally, America's jurors were considered to be citizen judges who not only watched over the robed judge and attorneys, but were especially committed to ensuring the practice or the justice was done in every courtroom. To see a biblical basis for citizens acting as judges in this manner, refer to 1 Corinthians 6:2. So if you have this particular Bible, go to 1 Corinthians 6:2. Do you not know that this? If I can talk today, it'd be amazing. Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? If the world is to be judged by you, are you not competent to constitute the smallest law courts? From the beginning, American juries held a twofold responsibility: examining the facts in a particular case and judge the law at the center of the controversy. They understood that if a law was tyrannical, enforcing it would prevent justice rather than secure it. Consider what would have occurred in Daniel, or if Daniel in the Bible had been a defendant in these early American courts. In Daniel's case, a law had been passed declaring that prayers could be offered to no one but King Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel broke the law, prayed to the one true God, and was arrested. Daniel 6:7-16. If that case had been brought before an American jury in a court of justice during the 1600s, 1700s, or 1800s, Daniel would have immediately been acquitted. The law under which he was being tried would have been adjudged unjust and despotic, violating Daniel's inalienable right to pray to his God according to the dictates of conscience, even if the judge had told the jury that Daniel had definitely violated the clearly written law and that the jury must therefore return a verdict of guilty. The judge's instructions would have been ignored. The jury was a check and balance on a judge to ensure that justice was done, and therefore it had the right to judge both the law and the effects. I would love to see an American jury stand up and say, "Judge, you're out of line and we're overruling you."
That'd be great.
And the judge I would wonder what would happen. Would it go to the Supreme Court?
I don't know. I don't know what would happen with that.
Because it should. It should go back before the Supreme Court, and it should be brought before them. Really, I don't even know if that's really the place that it should go back to. I wonder how we would handle that if an American jury stood up to a judge and said, "Judge, you're out of line, and the law you're finding this person guilty of is out of line and it's wrong and it's tyrannical, and we're holding the person exonerated."
And that would be interesting. Or we're holding the person guilty that you found innocent.
Mm-hmm. So juries in early America often shone brightly in this regard. For example, during the Massachusetts witch trials from 1691 to 1692, 19 defendants were convicted and sentenced, and 8 others died in prison as a result of awaiting trial. But then juries stood up and acquitted or released the next 52 defendants, often in opposition to direct instructions given to them by judges. In 1735, newspaper publisher Peter Zenger of New York was taken to trial for his printed attacks against Governor William Cosby.
Bill Cosby.
Yep.
Alive clear back then? I didn't know he was that old.
He's that old. British law at the time forbade anyone from criticizing a British official, even if the criticism was truthful and valid. The judge therefore instructed the jury to convict Zenger for criticizing the governor, but the jury ignored the judge and acquitted Zenger, believing that any law that punished citizens for telling the truth was unjust. As the American Revolution approached, American juries refused to convict defendants under the British Navigation Acts, which treated American merchants and entrepreneurs as smugglers and criminals. The British responded by creating courts of admiralty from which juries were excluded and in which the accused was considered guilty until proven innocent. John Adams denounced this as the most grievous innovation and thundered, "In these courts, one judge presides alone. No juries have any concern here. No juries, thus no guarantee for justice." When America separated from Great Britain, the founders specifically enshrined juries in both the federal and state constitutions. To ensure justice was secured, juries were empowered to judge both the law and the facts. Therefore, in American courts of law, attorneys and judges argued all issues about the law and evidence in the presence of the juries, so the juries would be privy to all the facts. As one legal expert observed, judge and jury heard the same evidence and might disagree in interpreting it. But in the years leading up to the 20th century, a dramatic shift occurred, with the courts of justice devolving into courts of law. Upholding the law replaced the pursuit of justice. The impetus for this change was a series of jury decisions against megacorporations and monopolies of that day, after which several powerful legal groups began lobbying Congress and the Supreme Court to limit the power of juries. In 1895, and I have there was a lot of monopoly cases brought against, and not monopoly of the game, but monopoly trials brought against different corporations because they were acting as a monopoly. And I remember reading about this earlier on in my life. In 1895, the Supreme Court ruled that juries would no longer consider the law in a case, but only the facts. No longer would they serve as a check against the tyranny of a bad law. Rather, they would only be asked to decide whether an individual had violated the law, even if the law was unjust. At that same period, Congress passed a law birthing the Federal Courts of Appeals system. There had previously been no need for such a system, for juries had always been the final word. In the new Federal Court of Appeals system, judges began to tell one another and the judges below them what the law was. Judges had taken control of the law and become its sole interpreters. Juries were still involved, but the judges now controlled the juries. Juries were no longer privy to all the facts and the evidence, and many of the legal arguments began to occur outside of their presence, either in the judges' chambers or in written arguments to which the jury was no longer given access. Juries received only the information that the judges allowed them to know. The judges had replaced the jury as the most powerful force in the courtroom. So American citizenry gave up their right.
It's a lot harder to get it right back than it is to give one up.
Consequently, had Daniel been tried in the 20th century court of law, he definitely would have been convicted. The judge would have told the jury what the law was, and that Daniel had violated the law, and that he must therefore be convicted. Nothing was more important than following the law as interpreted by judges. In fact, if a jury tried to exercise its traditional historic role of considering not just the facts but also the law, judges were told to declare a mistrial or overturn the verdict, or overturn the jury verdict. In the latter part of the 20th century, yet another devolution occurred, this time moving downward from courts of law to nothing more than courts. According to current legal definitions, a court is now merely a locale or a body to settle disputes. Securing justice was the original objective of courts. Then it shifted to upholding the law. Now it is merely settling disputes and ending arguments. Hence, modern courts have shown eagerness to strike down laws that stand in the way of settling a dispute, preferring instead to impose their own judicially crafted policy that they believe best ends the disagreement. Under this arrangement, the people's role in the judicial system is the smallest it has ever been in the history of the Republic, and justice has been the casualty. But justice is important. It is a biblical concept, and not surprisingly, since so many components of judicial justice are biblically derived, as America has become increasingly secular over the past century, the pursuit of justice has diminished. Americans need to regain the knowledge and understanding of biblical provisions for justice in the courts. They should also seek and accept every opportunity to serve on a jury. for biblical-minded citizens serving in courtrooms can help restore justice.
That's right.
And we're going to end there. This did not at all go the direction I thought it was going to go, nor had I planned on. But we will continue on next time talking about the Puritans. And I think that it really tied together, though, really beautifully, because the Puritans were after justice and they really wanted to see biblical law and biblical rule, and to take away the power of the court, the power of the kings, which operated like jury, judge, and executioner in England. And so it really tied together really beautifully. And I've been really wanting to talk about the juries because it is so vitally important that we understand the rule of juries in America and what their power was and
what it should be.
Because a lot of the arguments from the citizenry today in regards to police actions, in regards to the judges and the courtroom decisions, it really comes down to this very issue right here. Because the juries were to be the citizen power that was to oversee the judges. And we have given so much power to the judges, who oftentimes in one of the things that in the in that section they were talking about monopolies in the corporations and stuff. We've given so much power to the judges that they can come in and say, well, yeah, you can now a corporation can now patent a known seed. They can patent and own the very essence of life itself. If you think about it, that's really what the jury or what the judge in the Monsanto case is really decided. And if you look at it, what people don't realize, I'm going off on a little bit of a rabbit trail here, I'll bring it really quickly back. Justice Clarence Thomas is one of the judges that sided with Monsanto in being able to create patents for genetically modified organisms. Guess who Justice Clarence Thomas used to be the chief counsel for?
I'm assuming Monsanto.
So we have a judge that gets to sit on the Supreme Court and then gets to rule in favor of his former employer over whether they can patent a certain form of life or not. I thought life was created by God, not man.
Yeah. So we need a jury to get on there and say, judges, you're wrong.
You
think about the whole... It was as though our founding fathers designed it for the jurors to be the judge and to be the babysitter of the judge. Mm-hmm. And now we have it the other way, where the judges babysit the juries, and they're just a formality.
Right. And we have given up so much of our God-given rights and God-given authority because we don't understand and we did not pass on this teaching to our children. Mm-hmm. This goes back to the fatherlessness. It goes back to the time before the women's suffrage. It goes back to landowners. Why was that so important that landowners be the voters in our country? And I know this cuts cross grain, but if you really stop and think about it, did it have to be a large piece of land? Nope. It could be a house.
Right.
It could be a tenth of an acre that you have your house on. You're still a landowner. Mm-hmm. But if you think about it, how do renters care for their stuff in comparison to landowners?
Generally not very good. And well, it's that idea of if you own land, then you've got skin in the country.
Mm-hmm.
You've literally put your money where your citizenry is.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not to say that renters aren't patriotic,
Right.
but it's the idea of, when you look at the idea of private property,
It does something. Owning a piece of private property does something in your psyche, in your mentality, that changes how you view. I have a friend of mine that is a property manager. He's a landlord. He owns property, and is a farmer, and rents out houses and different stuff. And he even commented one time to me while he and his wife were down in Lincoln with their Lincoln, Nebraska, with their son who had leukemia. Had it as a kid and then re-got it as a early teen or early 20-year-old. He commented to me that while they were living in an apartment down in Lincoln, while they were doctoring with their son down there, he goes, it was weird. He goes, we're renting this apartment, and I found myself taking on the mentality of a renter. Well, it's not mine, so I don't care.
yeah,
It's not mine, so I don't care. And so it really does something to our psyche when we are have a renter's mentality versus an ownership mentality, private property ownership mentality. And that goes back to communism versus capitalism, because communism, you are not a owner.
no, there's no private property.
You are a renter of the state.
Right.
Really, essentially.
You're serfs, you're not citizens.
Right. And so we'll wrap it up there, but we'll come back to this next time. Like and subscribe and share. Please stop over to teshuahtea.com, TESHUAHTEA.com, or deliverancetea.com, and visit the website and pick up some of the tea or coffee. We've been drinking the Imperial Palace, or not the Imperial Palace, the Feather Mountain tea on this episode. And
Excellent tea.
yeah, and I don't know if you noticed the honey notes. I noticed, even though it's a black tea, that still had some underlying honey notes in it, and so I find it a really enjoyable tea. But we'll just wrap up there, and I appreciate it very much. Have a great day, you guys. I love you all. Be blessed. Bye-bye. You've been listening to the Liberty Unveiled podcast, setting captives free one episode at a time. The Liberty Unveiled podcast is a part of the Unresolved Podcast Network and has been brought to you by Teshuah Tea Company, TESHUAHTEA.com or deliverancetea.com.